Well, last week we broke up Israel, and we've, at this point, have Israel in the north and Judah in the south, the northern 10 tribes, and then Benjamin and Judah in the south. We talked about the first two kings of each nation, and here's kind of how it lays out for the last three sessions. Today we're going to focus on the north. We're going to focus on Israel. Israel will be the first of the two to fall. Next week, we're going to look at Judah, and we're going to focus on the ultimate defeat of Judah. And then in the final week, we're into our third empire in 3 weeks. This week, it's the Assyrian Empire that knocks off Israel. Next week, it's the Chaldean Empire, or the Neo-Babylonians, that knock off Judah. And then in our last week, we'll see the rise of the Persians. And we're going to hang out in the book of Esther and look at the book of Esther in a way that you've probably never looked at it before. Maybe you have, but probably not. There's a lot of material if you read really from the middle of 1 Kings through the rest of 2 Kings. And if you just try to read it and sit down and read it like a novel, it's very dry, it's very repetitive. This king comes to power during the whatever year of this king in the south, and they're paralleling each other. What I want to do today is focus on one story in particular in 1 Kings, which I think highlights better than any other story, and this is probably because God gives us so much information about it, way more than any other king of Israel, way more than any other circumstances going on. We're going to focus on one story, and through that story, we're really going to understand what's happening in Israel in the north. And you're going to see through this story how desperate Israel is and how far they have strayed from God and God's ways and God's norms, and how in the grips of the Canaanite fertility religion that they've really become. Before we get to that story, I've got a couple of neat charts to share with you. And again, just these charts have a ton of information. This is the genealogy of the kings of Judah. The kings of Judah are over here in sort of the purple color. And Israel, the kings of Israel are over here. The chart is laid out so you can see who overlaps with who. You could do an entire college-level course on just the kings of Israel and Judah and see how they line up with each other and what's going on in both. But this is kind of a neat chart just to see, you start with Saul, David, Solomon, and Rehoboam, and this is how far we've gotten, right? And you got all this. And you got all this. We talked about Jeroboam, and then his descendants come along. Today we're going to hang out in what is called the Amritic dynasty, which is really in the middle here of the history of the north of Israel. And we're going to talk about a king that you've all heard about, Ahab, and we're going to talk about his wife Jezebel, who you've all heard about probably your whole life. Because this really, and I think the reason God focuses on it is because this really brings to light how far Israel has gone and how far these northern 10 tribes are from the orthodoxy and the teachings of God. The next chart is, I call it the great, the good, and the bad. These are the kings of Judah, and we're going to focus on this a little more next week. As you're reading through, you always read these lines. He did what was good in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father David, or he did what was bad in the sight of the Lord. And, one interesting thing, actually, I was thinking about from the sermon this week. We've differentiated David and Solomon, and we've painted them both in a very negative light. But you see the Bible writers are constantly referring back to David positively. They're constantly thinking, oh, you walked in the way of your father David, therefore you're good. Or good, if you're really good, you're revival good, right? Why is David good and Solomon bad when they both did such bad things? Well, the answer was in the sermon this week. Repent. David repented. Solomon never did. We didn't have any verses during the sermon where Solomon repented. He lived that life out. You know, I have students ask me, is Solomon in heaven? I'm like, well, I'm not the arbiter of decisions like that, but he didn't repent, and he chose his sinful ways. And the Bible tells us if you live in your sin and you choose your sin and you do not repent of your sin, it's bad news, right? So if I had to guess, Solomon's not hanging out with the Lord these days. That's just my opinion. You're free to have your own. We have some highlights in Judah. We have some, they were okay. And we have some absolute disasters of kings who did bad. You know, but in all the history of Judah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kings that are considered good. I would show you the chart for all the kings of Israel. But it'd be really boring because they would all be down here. Every one of them. You won't find a king in the north who ever walked in the way of the Lord or walked in the way of David and was good in the sight of the Lord. You won't find it. Of course, that also highlights the very pro-Judah bias that we have in 1st and 2nd Kings. And again, remember the context. Where did we go wrong? They highlight the bad stuff in 1st and 2nd Kings. You want to read the good stuff? Go to Chronicles. You want to read the bad stuff? Hang out in 1st and 2nd Kings. I always think the bad stuff's way more interesting. This is a very busy chart, I know, but let me explain it to you for a minute, because this one takes the kings of the north and the south and then transposes the prophets. You know, one of the most frustrating things about the Old Testament is that some of the books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings are chronological. That's the way we're used to reading a history, right? You start at the beginning and then you work your way through. Well, the Old Testament as a whole is not chronological. You can see many of the prophets here, and the ones with the green stripes go with the kings in the green, which are the kings of Judah. The ones with the yellow stripes in them, the prophets, that means they're a prophet in the north. And so they're a prophet in the north or the prophet in the south. And prophecy, we've been talking about prophecy in our Bible study a little bit. Prophecy was the way that God really communicated with the people and kept them on the straight and narrow as much as possible, or kept trying to get them to turn back towards him, that constant turn away theme. And so this one also mixes in, here's the kings of Assyria. We're going to talk about some of them today. It's crazy names. Ashur-nazir-pal, Shalmaneser. I like to tell my students that's Shamalama Ding Dong in my class. But Shalmaneser, you've got... you got Nebuchadnezzar down here of the Babylonians. He's in red. He's the one who will defeat Judah. Shalmaneser is the one who will defeat Assyria. Assyria actually finally falls. Shalmaneser V is the one when Assyria falls in 722. Just some crazy names. Probably ought to use them for your grandkids, right? This is my grandson, Tiglath-Pileser. Yeah, right. But it's a really interesting chart, chock full of information. And if you're ever sitting there reading the Bible and you want a chronology, having a chart like this is very helpful. Or anytime you're reading a book of prophecy. First thing you need to look at, the books of prophecy are the last 17 books of the Old Testament. First thing you need to look at is, where were they a prophet to? Because it was one of two places. It was either Israel or Judah. And God would send a prophet when they were struggling, most commonly. And so you need to see when or where they were a prophet to, and then by the kings you can tell when they were a prophet. You know, so Jeremiah, I did a big study on the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet during the fall of Judah. And he's actually the one that says, you got to let it go. This is God's desire for you to fall. And they're like, what? This is the land of milk and honey. We can't fall. But these prophets would go send them the word of God. This is what God actually wants. And so we've got this really interesting blend of histories going on here. We've got the history of the ancient Near East, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians, the three great empires, the three great pre-Greek empires. And then you've got the history of the North and the history of the South, and then you've got these prophets working their way in. So you've got this beautifully layered history that can get super confusing unless you have a chart like this. And that might make it more confusing, I don't know, but it just tells you how confusing it is. I'm going to do quite a bit of reading to you today from the Bible. I'm using a New Revised Standard And I told Mark this. The only reason I'm using the New Revised Standard is because this is the one that I used, that we had to use when we took the class in graduate school. And I made all these notes in here. And this is the only thing I use this particular Bible for, is when I teach ancient Israel, because I got all these really cool notes and circles, and I didn't want to have to transpose that into another translation. So I went ahead and stuck with this translation, and it's really good for this subject, actually. Let's begin in 1 Kings chapter 16. God spends a lot of time, basically some of 16, all of 17, and parts of 18, on the story of Ahab and Jezebel. He spends more time on Ahab, a wicked king of the north, than he spends on like 3 or 4 of the good kings of the south combined. And you're like, why? Do we learn more from our mistakes in life or from our successes in life? I think we learn more from our mistakes in life. Those are lessons we'll never forget. So God emphasizes sometimes the mistakes, and particularly in the context of kings, this is a perfect story for kings. Where did we go wrong? Oh my gosh, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. We're going to have this big showdown of going wrong versus going right. In 1 Kings 16:29 through 33, it says this. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel. And he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Okay, so he's the pinnacle of wickedness here in the north, which is why God uses him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal. If you're the daughter of Ethbaal, the PK should not be marrying the daughter of Ethbaal, right? The preacher's kid. Ethbaal, that means of Baal, of the fertility god of the Canaanites. She was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Sidon was a city in Phoenicia, which was really the heart of Canaanite religion and worship at this time. So Jezebel, what God is saying here, is a deep-seated Canaanite. And you're going to see Ahab had the same problem Solomon did. But it was just one woman for Ahab that drug him to the dark side, right? He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole. We talked about that last week, or 2 weeks ago, and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel before him. Okay, so God is setting the stage, right? Ahab, really bad, really bad. And so it kind of makes the reader say, ooh, I wonder, what did he do, right? And the great thing about this story is God tells us all this stuff that he did. In 1 Kings 17:1, now Elijah, so here's the prophet getting weaved into this history. Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, now this is basically a pauper of a prophet approaching a king, right? It's got to be intimidating. They already had this back and forth. I skipped over the back and forth. They already have this back and forth going on. Ahab knows who Elijah is, and you're going to hear what he calls him here in a minute. But Elijah, the prophet, walks up to Ahab, imagine this, and says, as the Lord of God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Now this is where we really get into context. What have we learned about the significance of rain in the Canaanite religion? He's basically saying, I'm cutting Baal off. You're going to worship him, and you're going to think he's mad at us. Because God, the master marketer, is using their own belief system against them. It's ingenious. It's beautiful. God, through Elijah, says, I'm going to stop the rain for years. I mean, that's just a brutal sentence. And Ahab, wouldn't you like to have seen his face? You're going to what? After a long time, in the 3rd year, so 3 years, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, go and present yourself to Ahab again, and I will send the rain into the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. Imagine 3 years of no rain. We might just settle for 3 hours right about now, but 3 years of no rain. Brutal in an agrarian culture, particularly brutal in a culture that worships the rain god, the fertility god. This is great. When Ahab sees Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" I mean, Elijah probably wore that as a badge of courage. He probably went out and got T-shirts with "Troubler of Israel" written on it, right? Elijah responds, "I've not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel and meet me at Mount Carmel." We're all old enough to remember this. Howard Cosell, right? Howard Cosell, and he's going to call Muhammad Ali's The Thriller in Manila. That I always go back and I hear Howard Cosell's voice narrating the prophets of Baal and Elijah fighting the prophets of Baal to me. And it's almost like you hear the Monday Night Football theme and Howard Cosell doing the highlights. We used to have to watch highlights once a week. Can you believe that? "Now summon the people from all over Israel and meet me at Mount Carmel. And bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Now, this is very interesting. The prophets of Baal, the Canaanites, right? The Phoenicians, others, but mostly Phoenicians. Who's Asherah? Ashur. Ashur is the rain and fertility god of the empire of Assyria. That is the superpower of the ancient Near East at this time. They're mean, they're nasty, they're the New England Patriots, basically, right? They're horrible. They're the superpower. They always win. They can defeat anybody, except we'll see one people they can't defeat. And so this is a showdown that Elijah's setting up. He's saying, you bring all of your best prophets. By my count, that's like 850 prophets. And we're going to have a showdown. And you're thinking, okay, this is going to be Elijah sitting at a podium and they're going to have a theological debate. No, it's way better than that. Way better than that. But before we get to it, I wanted to show you a couple of pictures. First of all, here's Mount Carmel. Remember that little notch on the coast? Mount Carmel is right there. And if you look closely, I couldn't find the perfect map, but this is Phoenicia. Actually, the Phoenician line is right here. So just to the north of Mount Carmel is Phoenicia. Just to the south of Mount Carmel is Israel. And so Mount Carmel is right on the border. And look at what Mount Carmel looks like. This is a drawing of it. This is what Mount Carmel looks like. What do you notice about Mount Carmel? What's it look like? It's flat. It's like a plateau. It's like a stage. It's like a stage so people this way and people this way can see it for miles. And I'm thinking tailgating. They're probably showing up, waving their ball flag, and, a few Jews are in the crowd be like, Elijah. They got their one Elijah flag, and they're ready for the big game. They're ready for the show. They came for a show. I mean, this is just epic. Think Howard Cosell's voice. Maybe Keith Jackson a little later. In 1 Kings 18, it says this, in verses 20 and 21. So Ahab sent word throughout all of Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people, and he brings it right to them. And he says, how long will you waver between two opinions? I think Elijah could stand in the front of a lot of churches in America today and say, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? How long are you going to seek the secular pleasures of the world and deny the teachings of God? And he's condemning not only Ahab, but all of the people in this crowd. Had to be thousands and thousands of people. I mean, we got 850 prophets. The crowd was enormous. They knew something amazing was about to happen. How long do you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. I mean, that's a throwdown, right? That's very neutral. Everybody could agree with that. Now, the polytheist might say, why can't we follow them all? Because Yahweh personally excludes that. If you're going to follow somebody else, then you're not following me. And so that mixed theology doesn't work, and they probably knew it. They knew what these Jews were all about. And there had to be a lot of people in that crowd who were formerly Jewish and had kind of walked away, right? But this was the biggest thing in town. The ancient world was really boring, right? Not a whole lot to do. This is a show. They're all going to come, even if they got misgivings about what they might hear. Probably a lot of curiosity. Then Elijah said to them, Elijah is better than any magician that you're going to see in Branson or even in Vegas, right? I mean, this is the master showman. And you know how magicians like to set things up? I'm going to do this trick. But first I'm going to do this, which is going to make it really hard. And then I'm going to do this, which is going to make it doubly hard. And then I'm going to, oh my gosh, you're not going to do that. There's no way you can do the trick. Elijah's the same kind of showman. He says, it's only me. One of the Lord's prophets left in all of Israel. But Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us, he tells the crowd. Now, that's significant, isn't it? Because the bull is the symbol of Baal and the symbol of fertility. And it would have been the ultimate sacrifice in Canaan to sacrifice a bull because that's the symbol of Baal. Get 2 bulls for us, and let Baal's prophets choose one for himself. It's like my mom used to say when we had one piece of apple pie left, and my brother and I both wanted it, and she'd give my brother the knife and say, cut it in half. And then your brother gets to choose which piece he wants, right? It's like the ultimate arbiter. Well, Elijah's playing by the same rules. He's like, you pick which bull you want. This isn't a setup. You pick what bull you want. Cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but don't set fire to it. This is going to be a sacrifice. This is going to be ritualistic, right? I'll prepare the other bull, the one that you rejected. I'll prepare the other bull. Pick a card, pick a bull, any bull, right? Then you call the name of your God, and now he's talking to the prophets. You 400, you call the name of your God, and I'll call on the name of my God. And the God who answers by setting fire to the bull laying on the massive fire wins, right? And what do all the people say? That's fair. That's good. Let's go. What you say is good. This is they're good ground rules. Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are not very many of you. Call the name on your God, but don't light the fire. So they took the bull given to them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning to noon. Baal, answer us. Baal, Baal. But people had to be like, boo, this is boring. Somebody throw a pass, do something, right? Boo. But there's no response, and no one answered. They danced around the altar they made. They went to extreme measures. Elijah's sitting there going, dun, 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 right? It's like, come on. Just smiling. Oh, no, take your time, take your time. At noon, Elijah begins to taunt them. I love this. This is great. Shout louder. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe Baal has a hearing aid and it's not turned up. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought. No, oh wait, maybe he's busy or he's traveling. Maybe he's off visiting Mrs. Baal. You don't want to know who that is, but maybe he's sleeping and he needs to be awake. I mean, this is totally needling the prophets of Baal, isn't it? And they had to be getting furious with Elijah. It's like, shut up. Let us do our thing. So they shouted louder. Then they started slashing themselves with swords, cutting themselves. This was very common in pagan religious beliefs in the ancient Near East, causing bodily harm to oneself, basically making yourself sort of a sacrifice to God. Surely they'll listen if I'm willing to sacrifice myself. The blood flowed. Now it's getting interesting because there's blood and it's a mess. These guys are screaming and wailing and bleeding. Midday passes. They continue their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice arrives. You know, it's time for the evening sacrifice. Children, come in. We're going to light something on fire. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah says to the people, come closer. And the people are like, whoa, something's about to happen. Come here to me. And they came to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Apparently, there had been an altar on the top of Mount Canaan to the Lord, and he repairs it. And those people knew what that was, that their people were responsible for tearing down. So Elijah repairs it. He took 12 stones for the 12 tribes. One for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. I mean, this is right in your face, Israel. With the stones, he built the altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 sheaves of seed. Think 55-gallon drum, basically. That much seed. He arranged the wood and cut the bull into pieces and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, it's like the magician, can I get a volunteer from the audience? And somebody comes up, and he gives them this big jar and fill it with water. Now, they're on the top of a mountain, okay? This is no simple task. Go fill it with water. And you can see this poor volunteer from the audience, dragging this thing of water up. And he finally gets to the top, and Elijah's like, dump it over the fire. Get all the wood wet. And the guy's like, okay. The guy sits down, and Elijah's like, oh, no, you're not done. I'm going to do a better trick than that. Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering of the wood. I mean, it's wetter than just outside my office door is right now. I mean, it's like a mud pit, right? It was wet. There's no way that this is going to light. That's the whole point. Do it again, he said. What? And they did it again. I mean, this has got to be drawn out. This is all for effect. They bring it up and they dump another 4 on there. Do it again. They're like, shut up. We get the point. It's not going to light. Do it again. And they did it again. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the entire trench. This would be quite a trick. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed one time. Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are the God in Israel and that I am your servant. And I have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me. So these people will know that you are God and that you are turning their hearts back to you. He didn't have to do it for hours. He didn't have to cut himself. He didn't have to walk around wailing. He didn't have to have 449 other guys wailing with him or 849 other guys wailing with him. One time. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil. It even licked up all the water from the trenches. And you could have gone up to that dirt and it was dry as it was during the famine. Bone dry. Story over, right? I mean, God wins. Can you imagine the reaction of the people in the crowd? Oh my gosh. Many of them were in the presence of a real God. And notice the elements that God is manipulating here. He's manipulating fire. There's wind in the story. He's manipulating wind. And most importantly, he's manipulating rain and water. And I think back to the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt and how each one of those plagues Each one of those plagues was an attack on a different Egyptian god. And the final plague was on the Pharaoh himself, which was probably Thutmose III, but on the Pharaoh himself by killing his own son. God is giving a not-so-subtle message to the people who see it. But to us, it's subtle because we weren't Canaanite. We weren't ancient Hebrew. We didn't have all this experience of what it was like in the world at the time, but they would have instantly understood that this was game, set, match, checkmate, whatever you want to say. God wins, Baal, fake. Right? I mean, it's against all the odds. It's against the laws of nature. It's 850 to 1. But that's not the end of the story, because that's not the way God rolls. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let them get away." I mean, he turning this into a riot. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley, where they were slaughtered. This is not your kinder and gentler God. This is what happens to people who lead massive numbers of people astray. And God always likes to go after the ones in the pulpit, whatever flavor the pulpit is. That's who He attacks the most. That's why we got to be in constant prayer for those who are brave enough to get into the pulpit, right? We probably all know a pastor in our life who the devil got to him. The devil got to all of these supposed prophets. The devil got to Ahab. The devil got to Jezebel. I think Jezebel was spawned of the devil, but keep in mind, Elijah is doing this in front of Ahab. Ahab is probably sitting there in his posh throne, probably surrounded by people feeding him grapes with a little fan or whatever. Elijah says to Ahab, after this is over, "Go eat and drink, for there's the sound of heavy rain." So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed back to the top of Mount Carmel, bent down on the ground, and put his face between his knees. "Go and look towards the sea," he told his servant. Now, you remember the map, it's right by the Mediterranean Sea. He just says, "Go and look at the sea." 7 times, Elijah said, "Go back." What do you think that is a reference to? 7 times. What else takes place 7 times in the Old Testament? Remember the walls of Jericho? How many times do they have to walk around the walls of Jericho? 7 times. They had to defeat Jericho by walking around the walls of Jericho 7 times so they could enter the land of milk and honey. So he says 7 times. He would have known instantly what 7 times was a reference to. We don't remember that sometimes. 7 times. 7 times Elijah said, "Go back." And the 7th time the servant reported, "There's a cloud. It's going to rain." A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. Now, I don't know if it's a man's hand like looking over the horizon, which makes it look really big, or if it was a really small cloud. So Elijah said, "Go get Ahab. Go tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Meanwhile, the sky grows black with clouds, and the wind rises, and the heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. He put his tail between his legs, and he went back to his palace in Jezreel. Wow. God shows up and delivers, doesn't He? He doesn't just deliver a very powerful, very illustrative victory over the prophets of Baal. He delivers a victory over Baal himself, the god of the rain. Remember the first lines that we had today. God telling Elijah, "Tell Ahab we're going to have a famine for 3 years. 3 years later, this scene takes place, and God culminates this awesome scene with rain. What do you think the people were doing when the rain came down? I mean, you're talking, they're mentally blown away. They're probably physically exhausted for being there for an entire day. They see this amazing miracle. They're just spent. And then it starts to pour after 3 years of no rain. They're like, party. This is incredible. This is absolutely amazing. Remember the significance of rain in not just Canaanite culture, but all of the culture of the entire ancient Near East. Remember, we're in the Fertile Crescent here. This area where, compared to the rest of the Middle East, it gets a lot of rain. It's called the Fertile Crescent because it's green. You can grow stuff there. That's what makes it so attractive. God does not give his people the schlub land. God gives his people the best of the best. The rain is eminently important in this region of the world. And Baal is the god of rain and fertility. Remember the first words. As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. God's his own prophet here, isn't he? He's given the word to Elijah, but these are God's words through Elijah. I will bring the rain. Your God has nothing to do with the rain because he's a fantasy. He's a figment of your imagination. God, the true God, is the greatest messenger. He defeats their God or gods by using their own attributes against them. God does this several times in the Old Testament. Several times. What would the attributes be if God wanted to deliver a message in today's world? There's a great story of if God, when God comes back, is he going to walk into the church and sit in the pews, or is he going to be wearing his Sunday finest? Is he going to hang out with us? Would we recognize him? The Jews didn't. And they were pretty tuned into the whole God theme, and they didn't recognize him. Who would God be going after when he comes back? Or if he wants to do another demonstration of this magnitude in today's America? Probably not you and me. He's already got us. We'd love to see him. It'd be great. But he's going to go after the lost. He's going to go after the followers of Baal, and there are so many people following Baal right now. Whether it's literally Baal, which there's probably very few following, or figuratively Baal, which is secular humanism, in my opinion, is people in the world today who consider themselves to be the god of their own existence. When we're at a high point of humanism like we are right now, where we think man can fix the climate, man can fix this, man. Baal couldn't fix the rain any more than we can fix the climate, right? May have some minor effect on it, but we're not going to fix it. And it always makes me wonder. And I got some students who are pretty anxious about the time we're living in, and I understand that. We should be too. And I always try to console them by saying, God's in charge of everything, right? And so God has created the circumstances that we're living in right now. Why do you think he's doing that? Well, people are just turning away from him. Yes, they are. Why do you think God is creating the circumstances today? Why do you think God allowed Canaan to do what it did? Because more people come to God in desperation. More people come to God. I used to represent a lot of pretty bad people in criminal courts. More people come to God sitting in jail than any place I've ever seen people come to God when they're facing hard time or worse, death, More people come to God in desperation, in hunger, in abject poverty. After Ahab's death, Moab, which was just to the east of Israel, just across the Dead Sea. Moab rebelled against Israel. So again, think of the context here. God gives us an amazing story during the reign of Ahab. Israel is defeated by God, but it still exists as a political entity, right? So God is going to bring other enemies and just let them steamroll over the northern 10 tribes. And it takes a generation for it to happen, and it happens brutally and horrifically. It sets the stage for the fall of Israel. That's the reason this story is in there. It's setting the stage for the fall of Israel. It's telling us how far Israel had turned away. And even when they have this respite of all those people in the crowd that turned back to God, now I don't know about you, but if I saw something like that, it would stick. It would stick really well. But we don't have any statistics. We don't know how many stuck with it. But what we know is Israel returned to worship the Baals. That also demonstrates how deep and penetrating Baal worship was in this culture. They could not shake it. And I think a lot of us, and this is why I love the word Israel, meaning a struggle with God, a lot of us struggle with a 1 foot in this world and 1 foot in our spiritual realm. And everything that we can do to get both feet into that spiritual realm, that's my struggle. That's probably the struggle of every one of us. Like, I got to give up this desires of the world stuff and realize that it's just a blip, a breath in time. And we need to have both feet planted in that spiritual world. And if we don't, we're going to get steamrolled. So this is not only a national lesson, this is a personal, very personal lesson. And the outcome isn't a mystery. In 722 BC, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became the king of Israel in Samaria. And he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hosea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal. Now, in feudalistic terms, a vassal is somebody who owns land but serves another lord, right? And so basically was a client king of the Assyrians. Very common phenomenon in the ancient Near East. Don't attack me, I'll give you money to not attack me. And that's what's going on here. He would pay him annual tribute, but the king of Assyria discovered Hoshea was a traitor and wasn't paying his full fee. He had sent envoys. So the king of Egypt, to the king of Egypt, so he no longer paid his tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seizes Hosea and puts him in prison. The king of Assyria would invade the entire land. He marched against Samaria and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah, in Gozan, on the Habor River, in the towns of the Medes. Now, this is a very sanitized version of what happened to the northern 10 tribes. And the Bible doesn't really elaborate on what happened to the people of the northern 10 tribes. But as I've mentioned before, we've done just enough of study on the Assyrians to know what happened to them. The men are killed. The men are not taken into exile. Probably most of the boys are killed. I mean, heads chopped off, build a pyramid with their heads killed. The women, worse. They're taken to Assyria and basically sold or given into slavery to Assyrian families who breed with them, have children with them, and they are no longer Israelites. They're Assyrians. They're bred out of existence. There's a reason we never hear from the Israelites again. We never hear from the 10 tribes again. It's because God allowed the Assyrians, who did mean and nasty things to their victims, to conquer them. Now, Assyria was enormous. I'm going to show you a map of the Assyrian Empire here in a minute. And in the back of your mind, you have to wonder, why didn't they just roll down and take Judah while they were there? What's going on with Judah? They're even weaker. Yeah, they got Jerusalem. It's got a nice wall around it, but come on, this is the Assyrians. As this took place, I mean, God tells us why it happened. It's not a mystery. As this all took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They worshiped other gods. They followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices of the kings of Israel that had been introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. Those hidden sins. God knows about them. From the watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all of their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles in every high hill, under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshiped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." And they didn't just do it for a year or 10 years or 100 years. They did it really beginning with Jeroboam. Remember Jeroboam's first words, which is why the author of Kings constantly refers, but he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and basically the same as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. I mean, Jeroboam gets more PR for being bad through the rest of Kings. He gets the PR for being bad in Israel that David gets for being good in Judah. You shall not do this. They did it anyway. It's not a mystery why this happens. God, we want a king, they said. Remember that? Surely the king will give us everything we want in this world. And God had to be thinking, except me, who should be your king. What about Judah? Well, God tells us about Judah in chapter 19. Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot a single arrow here. He's talking about Jerusalem. He will not come before it with a shield or build a siege camp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city, declares the Lord. I will defend this city and I will save it for my sake and for the sake of David my servant. That night, an angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. They were camped out outside the walls of Jerusalem, and they were going to go all helms deep on Jerusalem first thing in the morning, right? That's a Lord of the Rings reference if you don't get it. But they're going to attack this walled city. By the way, Tolkien was brilliant when he did this. If you've never seen the Battle of Helm's Deep, just go Google the Battle of Helm's Deep and watch it, because it is Assyrian technology that attacks Helm's Deep. The siege towers that approach, those were Assyrian. You see the little hut that they all run up under to keep them from getting the arrows fired. That was Assyrian. The Assyrians were the master siegers of the ancient world. When the people got up the next morning, there was all these dead bodies. Sennacherib, who was the king at that time, the king of Assyria, broke camp, you think, and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, which gives us a little context of Jonah. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. One day while he was worshiping in the temple of his god at Nisroch, his sons killed him with a sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, succeeded him as king. You lost to Judah, and you lost 185,000 men, and they didn't even draw a sword or fire an arrow at you. Once again, in a demonstration that is even bigger than Elijah and the prophets of Baal, God demonstrates what he says goes, and he protects Jerusalem. Why? Why? That's a rhetorical question. I don't know the answer to that. Jerusalem and Judah had no business in a militaristic sense, in a political sense, in in a geographic sense or in an economic sense, in any sense whatsoever, Judah had no logical explanation for continuing to exist. None. But they do. The only explanation is God had something up his sleeve. God wanted Judah to survive. How do you think the Judeans felt about this? Had to be mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing. How big was Assyria? Look at the size of this empire. And look where Jerusalem is in the empire. Did Jerusalem have any business surviving? I mean, this is an empire. Now, granted, this is after the new kingdom in Egypt, and this is, Egypt is weaker and a little more vulnerable, but it's still Egypt. They squash Egypt like a grape. Egypt had big army. Phoenicia and Palestine are paying massive ransoms to not be utterly destroyed to Assyria. You see, the Assyrians handled things one of two ways. And they engaged in a lot of psychological warfare. They would go into a village and wipe out man, woman, child, building, everything. Everything. Sparing one or two people that they would say, go tell the next village what you saw and tell them we're coming. Well, what do you think that next village did? We surrender. What are the terms? And what the Assyrians would do is they would take the people that surrendered and did not fight them and move them somewhere else in their empire to disorient them, because they would be less of a threat if they weren't on their own land. Now, you've heard me say the word Samaria a few times here, and Israel is often, Israel, the northern part after the divided kingdom, is often referred to as Samaria. Samaria were people that were brought in earlier by another empire doing this same tactic. And they'd been there long enough that they'd kind of established themselves. And so you had one of two choices: die and suffer this awful consequence, or move, relocate. Most people chose the relocation plan. And it was actually an extremely effective way of Assyria governing this massive empire that they had. They were also the first, well before the Romans. We know a little bit more about the Romans because that's Jesus' time. And you've got governors of these various provinces of Rome. At the time of Jesus, there was 142, it's sort of the equivalent of states, 142 states in the Roman Empire. And each one has a governor who's loyal directly to the emperor. And we all know who the governor of Judea, which is the Roman Latinized name for Judah, who was the governor of Judea when Jesus was around. There's actually two of them. Felix was the first one. The second one, of course, was Pontius Pilate, right? He's the governor, and they're given a broad amount of discretion to act on behalf of the emperor. Well, Assyria did this 500 years before the Roman Empire even thought of existing, 700 years before the Roman Empire thought of existing. They called them satraps instead of provinces. They were satraps, and the leader was the satrapy. And so they would take these people and move them from one satrap to another satrap, have this governor very strictly over them. They would still let them practice their religion. They would still let them have their local customs, but they were doing it all under the umbrella of the Assyrian Empire, who they would pay tribute to, and then they would be protected by the Assyrians. They would also have to give probably about half of their sons to the Assyrian army. So of that 185,000 that are wiped out, there were probably men from all of the various satraps who were tasked with conquering Jerusalem, and little did they know they met too much of an enemy. So Israel falls in 722. We never hear from them again. All that we have left is Judah. Judah, I'll be a spoiler here, but next week we're going to look at Judah, and Israel was in a pretty constant state of decline. Judah does this. just like that chart of the kings of Judah. It just goes up and down and up. They have the high points under certain kings, like Josiah. They have very low points under certain kings. And so they ebb and flow and ebb and flow and ebb and flow, and ultimately in 587, 86, it was kind of over the winter of that. Remember, in ancient history, we go backwards. 587 and 86, Judah will fall. But the significant difference is, who do they fall to? And how do the Chaldeans, or the Neo-Babylonians, who had defeated the Assyrians with the help of a group called the Medes, who would later become Persians, how do they treat their vanquished? How do they treat their enemies? And they treat them very differently. And that's part of the story for next week that I think will blow your mind. Because they take the best and the brightest from everybody that they conquer. They take their writings. There was an incredible library at Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria, that when the Babylonians conquered it, they brought it all down to Babylon. And eventually, Babylon would fall. Babylon would fall to the Persians, and the Persians take it all over here. Persia's over here. It's modern-day Iran. They take it over to their capital, which was called Susa. And so there's this like roving library of all these ancient tablets and rolled-up texts and all this stuff. And finally, who conquers the Persians? A guy named Alexander, right? Alexander the Great. And he loves to keep the books. And he takes all the books and everything, and he builds a library down here in Egypt at Alexandria. Then the Romans, the stupid Romans, they come in and they burn it down, burn down all that history. It still makes us cry from all of those areas. And so we've just got this rich succession of empires. And next week we're really going to highlight the context of falling to the Babylonians as opposed to falling to the Assyrians. And even though Judah falls, God is still protecting them. And God is transforming them, and God is changing them. And it's while they're in exile in Babylon that they're away from their temple. Right? God, we want a king, and God, we want a temple because we want to be like everybody else. And they were becoming like everybody else. And so God goes, bloop, no more temple for you. And we're going to move you to Babylon. And so in Babylon, they invent this thing called the synagogue. They invent this position called rabbi, which is really just teacher, who leads them in this remote worship. They're getting away from this idea of temple worship, which is so ingrained for thousands of years in the entire ancient Near East. And what else the Babylonians do, I'm going to save for next week, because it's truly mind-blowing. It's truly mind-blowing. Anybody have any questions about that? Yeah.
I love how you worded all of that, because what's really interesting to me is back in 2 Samuel, when David was king, the Lord promised David through Samuel that there would be a successor to him. Of course, everyone was hoping it'd be one of these guys, and none of them were the successor, right, that would carry his kingdom on forever.
Forever.
Which, of course, we now know that his name is Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. But imagine people who, if you were sitting there and you saw Assyria come to the gates of Jerusalem, and then 185,000 die. If there was anybody there who remembered that promise to David, it's like, I wonder if they would put that together. History doesn't tell us.
And they might have thought it was Hezekiah, who was king at the time.
That's right.
Of Judah.
Which was problematic.
Yeah, which was a big problem. And to build on that point, what God is doing is laying the groundwork here for a completely different paradigm, a completely different way of thinking. These people wanted a temple, these people wanted a king. He strips both of them from these people, and he puts them in exile and have to start to worship a different way. And they start to have to think differently and do things differently. Then the Greeks come along and have this society that is really different than every ancient Near Eastern society. It's Western, what we now call Western. They didn't know they were Western, but it's Western. And they start to think differently, and they have these philosophers that have them thinking differently. And what God is doing through all of this is preparing them for an individual, personal Savior in Christ, which would have been unthinkable throughout most of the ancient world. Completely unthinkable. We don't even say his name. We don't even write his name. We don't utter his name. We don't approach him, or we'll spontaneously combust. It's significant that the veil is torn. There's no more Holy of Holies, right? cool stuff. It's really cool. I get excited. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. All right. Good. Right at an hour.